We're going to look at how we can pimp our digital pedagogy and actually do a few more things online over the next couple of weeks. So we're still very blog and wiki centred. As a matter of fact, you have all been asked by Wendy, if you haven't already, to get a Weebly going, to please get one going straight away, because most of your work over the next couple of weeks is going to be compiled portfolio style in the wiki. So what I'll do is I'll actually publish a small document or a small video talking about assessment item 2, so that we've all got a clear picture of where we're going as we go ahead. But this week we're talking about pimping our digital pedagogies. And when we look at it, before we explore that relationship, I've got a little diagram here that sort of brings, hopefully highlights the complexity of digital pedagogy. Now, when we think of pedagogy in the classroom, we're just looking at mapping authenticity, complexity and pedagogy. What we're looking at here is a 3D model. So when we talk about pedagogy, we know that down here at the foreground we've got drill and practice. And that's basically with the sage on the stage, the teacher at the front of the classroom, drilling and practicing various components. We have identified that as fairly didactic, and we've identified it as what we call a low-end pedagogy. Then we start to look at integrated learning systems, and they probably sit a little bit around about the middle here, where we're doing our blogging. Now, blogging's great, but you can blog away in the blogosphere forever and no one can ever hear you, and you can probably potentially not achieve much. So it's only when we actually start adding some 3D tools there, some productivity tools that we looked at in week 5, and hopefully your reflections cover in your synopsis. We look at adding productivity tools so that we can start to see this real authentic dimension coming to life. So we've got complex learning, we've got higher order and basic skills, we've got didactic, and we've got very constructivist teaching along here with coaching somewhere in the middle. And then once we start adding layers of technology, we can start to see how we get more and more authentic. Now, in our scenarios, that is, of course, and this week, Wendy introduced those concepts, authentic learning and problem-based learning, which basically situates the learner in the midst of what is technically a problem that's got real-world complexity. And so what we do is we try to map that authenticity alongside the complexity, and our goal is to come up with a pedagogy that's going to help mediate those two stages. So we're looking at a diagram a little bit like this. Where at the end of assessment task number 2, where will you be situated? We know you won't be engaged in the drill and practice level. We know that you'll be doing some integrated learning systems because you've already done that with your blog. We're now saying move into the wiki environment, move into your Weebly, where we can actually start looking at some productivity tools where the writer and the learner is actually also a producer within that environment. And as a producer within that environment is engaging in much higher order thinking than they would normally be doing were they down here at the drill and practice, at the passive end of learning. So it's an interesting diagram, if nothing else. Keep that one in mind as you go forward. I've actually put this PowerPoint up online so that it's there for you to actually retrieve, and any of these little images that you think might be useful. I mean, you could write a book basically on that one little image there, and a lot of people have. But by and large, it's a nice summary, it's a nice heuristic of where we're heading this term. So when we look at the relationship, the first thing we need to do is break a common misconception, and that is more technology equals more learning. Okay, we really need to challenge that concept because really it's a false concept. More of anything doesn't lead to a greater experience. We talk about the didactic or the transmission model, and we can see that transmission, for instance, doesn't necessarily lead to higher order thinking, okay, when we look at that particular model. And students are passive recipients, teachers simply present information. And what we have is a learning and teaching dialogue. How we actually capture and measure the learning is a different challenge. But technology, as we know from our work in the blogs, can provide more dynamic ways of using multimedia. It can shift us along our curve. So we can start to see some of that. And in this situation, more computers will equal more learning, okay, which is something we can look forward to. A little motto for the week: toolishness is foolishness. If a tool doesn't add to a program or doesn't add to a learning experience, then the question is, should you actually be using it? And this week we head back into the curriculum and we start looking again at the generic capabilities. Now this takes you probably back to year 2, maybe even year 1, when you were looking at the ACARA documents for the first time. Now ACARA published those new documents in 2012, and in their wisdom they have decided not to make, at least in the foundation to year 10s, they've decided not to make ICT capabilities a knowledge base or a knowledge source of its own. It's just a general capability which transcends all subject areas. So again, for that reason, we have to look at where we use tools. And Colin Lancashire, a good friend of mine, actually marked my PhD many years ago. He and Michelle Noble, who is actually now his wife, curriculum or pedagogy must not be hostage to technological change at the level of artefacts. So in other words, we've got to try and have technology. What he's trying to say there is we need to have our technology, but we've got to keep the curriculum and pedagogy free of it. Okay, we can't have it embedded in the technology, so we can't access learning without technology. So they must be separate. Okay, in other words, it's a fool's paradise. It's to believe that more technology, more artifacts can carry learning. It's actually the processes that do it. Technology can be a pedagogically useful tool, and we can use it to enhance the teaching and learning process. Now these are really quite given statements, and one such way is the application of technology to enhance communication between stakeholders in the learning process. And this is what we're trying to look at here in this course at this particular stage. We're trying to look at how to use technology to enhance communication processes. But when we use technology, a couple of things happen. Okay, the teacher has input to the computer, and the computer then has output to the student. We have to try and change that particular model. The student then communicates back through the computer to the teacher. As a concept, teaching hangs on the notion that information is not only transmitted, but also that it's received. And then once it's received, that it's understood. How do we know something has been received and understood though? This is the big chest question with technology. And the only way we can gauge that is by interaction. And once we start talking about interaction, we're moving further along that curve, aren't we? We're moving away from the drill and practice scenario right through to the more deep, more constructivist type learning. And it doesn't really hinge on moving the mouse or answering questions. It's much more about what people do when they're starting to exchange, and when students in this model were the consumers of pedagogy, they now become the producers through technology. Schools, here's a little example for you. I don't know whether anyone's seen this one before or even tried this online. This is from the role play software, and there's quite a few of them on the market now, but this was a few years ago and it was one of the only versions. And this is a really interesting story where this particular teacher was pairing together students, and they were doing creative writing. And in the role play model, you create a few basic rules, 3 simple rules, and students have to abide by them. And here's a really interesting story between Rebecca and Gary, obviously, who weren't the best of peers. And you can see Rebecca starts off. At first, Laurie couldn't decide which kind of tea she wanted. Interesting start. The chamomile, which was her favourite for late evenings, now reminded her too much of Carl, who once said in happier times that he liked chamomile. But she felt she must now at all costs keep her mind off Carl. His possessiveness was suffocating, and if she thought about him too much, her asthma started acting up again. So chamomile was out of the question. All right, we get the scene. Gary responds. Meanwhile, Advanced Sergeant Carl Harris, leader of the attack squadron, now in orbit over Skyline 4, had more important things to think about than neuroses of an airheaded asthmatic bimbo named Laurie, with whom he'd spent one sweaty night over a year ago. A.S. Harris to Geostation 17, he said into his transgalactic communicator. Polar orbit established, no sign of resistance so far. But before he could sign off, a bluish particle beam flashed out of nowhere and blasted a hole through his ship's cargo bay. The jolt from the direct hit sent him flying out of his seat and across the cockpit. Not to be outdone, Rebecca speaks up. He bumped his head and died almost immediately, but not for he felt one last pang of regret for physically brutalising the one woman who he'd ever feelings for him. Soon afterwards, Earth stopped its pointless hostilities towards the peaceful farmers of Skyline 4. Parliament passes law permanently, and it goes on, as you can see. Laurie read in her newspaper one morning, and ultimately, the philosophical reflection, why must one lose one's innocence to become a woman, she pondered wistfully. Okay, Gary had a look at this and thought, in his response. He writes back, "Little did she know that she had less than 10 seconds to live. Thousands of miles above the city, the Anudrian mothership launched the first of its lithium fusion missiles. The dim-witted, wimpy peaceniks who pushed the unilateral aerospace disarmament treaty through Parliament had left Earth a defenceless target to the hostile alien empires." And he goes on, it's quite good writing, as you can see. The lithium fusion missiles enter the atmosphere unimpeded. The Prime Minister, in a Collins submarine off the ocean off Cairns, felt inconceivably massive explosion which vaporised poor stupid Laurie and 5 million other Australians. Mr Abbott slammed his fist on the conference table. "We can't going to allow that. I'm going to veto that treaty." So let's blow them out of the sky, says Tony Abbott. Rebecca erupts at this stage, and you can see her response. "This is absurd. I refuse to continue this mockery of literature. My writing partner is a violent, chauvinistic, semi-literate adolescent." Gary replies, "Yeah, well, you're a self-centered, tedious neurotic whose attempts at writing a more literary equivalent of Valium. Oh, shall I have chamomile tea, or shall I have some other sort of tea? Oh no, I'm such an airhead bimbo who reads too many Daniel Steele novels." Rebecca, and you can see it goes back and forth. The ultimate thing, the teacher finally chimes in down here and stops it. And he gives both students an A+. He says, "I really like this one. They're the only group to get an A. They really seem to engage with the task." What do you think of that?
I thought it was hilarious.
It is rather funny, isn't it? Can you see that happening? It's quite interesting, isn't it? Once we set up these tasks, if we let the technology take over, we can see sometimes where things can go. And often they go to a stage where we don't necessarily really want them to go. Now, even though that technically I thought both pieces of writing were quite good, ultimately, locked into that format, the teacher's interaction with the technology and the students, that toing and froing, wasn't effective enough to lead to a really high order outcome. And of course, as you can see, we almost had domestic violence in the classroom. Effective interaction equals communication of thinking and learning processes. And that does bring us back to the whole notion of safety in the classroom, legality, safety, ethics. Make sure you cover those, because even in a simple blogging task like that, you can see how they come into play. When we look at this one, examples of when effective interaction is likely: when we're getting students to reflect, discuss, when they take on leadership roles, when they start to mentor other students, when they lead a process or teach a process, when they coach, when they're problem solving, when there's analysis, synthesis and evaluation. So these are all the sorts of stages when interaction is working, is helping the pedagogy. And these kinds of deeply contextualised can be supported by enhanced technology. And here's where we're moving with assessment task 2. We're now starting to look at how we can achieve some of this by using a multi-platform Weebly, which is going to enable us to use some productive pedagogies and some productive tools. So why drive this? We can look at Beamish and Hour from 1995 and look at the date 21 years ago. Even back then they were saying the educational value of technology does not lie in the computer per se, nor in the software used, but rather in the process of learning and teaching. In other words, provide metacognitive experience, teacher instruction and cooperation among learners. So our task this week, okay, for the assessment task 2 is where we had to actually, get in there and start our new assessment task 2. The first step was an embedded task which began with a brief pedagogical map. Now you were asked to pick your foundation to year 10 area. So, maybe it's not your strongest area in terms of curriculum sense or your curriculum duality, but it's your minor area. And so we're starting there. We're starting initially at the FT. And so this is someone who's been in schools for 20 years. And the thing about teaching, as you probably realise when you've been there a while, things change and change dramatically. But HASS, as we know, is history and social sciences. And so when we look at literacy, we can see these statements. They're a really strong statement of grammatical knowledge, text knowledge, visual knowledges, word knowledges, and students composing text through speaking, writing and creating, and comprehending text through listening, reading and viewing. So there are text consumers and text producers. So if you look at this document, this elaboration here, this generic competence, it requires both production and consumption of literacy. to be a functioning and operative and successful HASS student. It also requires the consumption and production of numeracy. Okay, we've got the capabilities, using measurement, estimating and calculating, recognising, using fractions, using spatial reasoning and interpreting. And of course that does involve statistical interpretation too. Okay, scaled timelines. Now you may not look at a timeline in history and think, oh, there's mathematics involved. Think again. Okay, all of history is scaled to a particular point in time. So all of these, you know, we're looking here at these elaborations. The other areas where we have the elaborations, of course, there's 7 of them across the curriculum. ICT capability, and that's the one that we're looking at in this particular subject. So locate, process, analyse, evaluate, communicate historical, geographic, civic and economic information using digital technologies. And have a look here. It's written, we've been talking about this for weeks. Discuss and debate to co-construct their knowledge. So we're talking about creating with ICT, investigating with ICT, communicating with ICT. So the documents are quite clear. Now when you get out on your school pracs, of course, you know, from PP3, you know that you'll be assessed by your school-based supervisor and your mentor teachers, and they will be looking at your use of ICT, not simply that you can turn on a computer, but they'll actually be looking at the critical ways and the deep pedagogies you're trying to embrace. Critical and creative thinking. As you can see, we've got some space there to go on too. Now, I won't go through each of these. They are here on the PowerPoint for you to go back. But for instance, if I was doing a, you know, my timeline or my little map, I would be looking at coming up with examples for how I can use ICT to achieve all of these you know, integrate these competences. Personal and social capability, ethical understanding. Okay, we can see they're all there. And you know, when you read the documents, you can see that they really are hinting at quite deep and quite elaborate curriculum understandings. Again, the final one, intercultural understanding. And notice here that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, histories and cultures pop up here, as well as the contribution of Australian migrants. So, you know, these are massive documents. And of course, it opens the pathway through how would we use, you know, technology to try and elaborate, try and create some of these understandings. Can we just do a whip around, please, and find out from you what area you're doing or what curriculum area you're using as the focus for this week's task?
I'm using technologies.
Oh, you're using technology. Okay, so you're actually going to be teaching in the ICT area.
Well, home economics comes under technology.
It does indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And I think you're the only one online at the moment, Phoebe, so you'll get to answer all the questions, which is fabulous.
Me and John are here.
Too, you are still here, yes? Great, good. What are you...
I'm here still too, Colin.
Great. So what area are you doing, John? You'd be doing something in the manual arts?
Yeah, that's right. I've only got the one screen. Yeah, I'm just purely man arts, that's it.
Right, and what about you, T?
I do history and geography, so I'm pretty much HASS.
Right, good, good. So you'd be looking at some of these comments too. Fantastic. I mean, HASS is a good broad one because it's got so many connections to other curriculum areas. And it's a model of the first few general capabilities as an example. Now, you are going to, for instance, you've got to pick your subject area. And what I did is I put up a copy of all 7 there. But basically, the aim is to start small. And as you can see that she's got here, for instance, some elaborations. So she's using junior science. Okay, and what she's got here is literacy, basically a statement from the documents. Students should understand ways to represent and comprehend text, including multimedia text, charts, graphs, etc. And so what she's doing, she's basically putting together, selecting items from the general capabilities and listing them. So, and she's saying to them, as you're going along, okay, your preparation, first of all, is to make a list and itemize the general capabilities. That's step 1. Step 2 is from the capabilities, start to add ideas about pedagogy, low end and high end. So what that basically means is you can see what she's done here. she's taken the initial one. Students should understand ways to represent and comprehend texts. And down here, she said in her literacy draft, students should understand ways to represent and comprehend text, including multimedia text, etc. Her reflection, low-end pedagogy need to explicitly teach the element of literacy. High-end pedagogy need to provide opportunities for students to communicate in this way. Linked to pedagogy, students critique a range of texts and the way ideas and knowledge. So what she's doing, she's actually listing up here, she's listing the generic capabilities. And from the generic capabilities in step 2 in her draft, she's actually listing an example of a low-end version of that and what a high-end version may look like. And then she's making a curriculum link. So that's the reflection task she's given you this week. Now, over time, clearly that's going to keep building because you'll keep adding to it as it goes along. So you'll finish up with quite a large table. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, we've put it into a Google Doc, so you can actually keep adding to it and keep being flexible for you. Given an example here, students should understand ways to represent, there's that same example coming up. The low-end pedagogy, she's put it into a table. The high-end pedagogy, links to pedagogies. ICT connections, she's going to add later. In my classroom or unit, she's going to leave for later. Two, they're the ones that are going to grow over time, and they're the ones where you'll be making your pedagogical intentions known and explicit. Some of my favourite things, the interactive whiteboard is a good one. So when you're teaching a lesson, and again, here's curriculum links, and when you're talking about, you may be teaching a simple class, the interactive whiteboard is great. Low end, I can stand there, for instance, and I can just do a chalk and talk. I'm the sage on the stage. Or, for instance, I can do what this teacher's doing. I can actually join. I can be the meddler in the middle. I can have a student up the front there demonstrating some pretty high-end work there with his protractor and all his mathematical tools. And I can actually, expose the computer. The computer no longer carries the hidden message. The computer is the vessel. Okay, it's the vessel by which we're all actually enjoying the work. So, and it all gets the students out from behind the computer, which is really important to see. It creates that collaborative workspace. Strong visual cues, great for group work. Now, these are all higher order pedagogy. So when you're thinking about your area, ultimately down the track, you're going to have to make connection to pedagogy. Okay, here is the pedagogical expression of what we've just been looking at in that document, where we're looking at all these generic capabilities. What do we want them to do? Okay, we want them to use ICT to develop deep, higher order understandings. Here we have a teacher doing that using a particular interaction, a particular piece of technology. And the nice thing about whiteboards too is they can produce lesson notes, a record of notes. So that as a teacher, you're always up to date with where you got up to at the last lesson. It's just a really, really powerful tool, an interactive whiteboard. And that would fit nicely into the table you're doing. What will you use in your classroom? Okay, I may be teaching a history lesson. I may be looking at the armistice in Germany, and you may be looking at the treaties, etc. around that. You could do a lot of really good work with an interactive whiteboard, much more than you probably could with a PowerPoint or a Prezi. Digital video is another thing to look at. Now we're looking at that a lot. We can see students, for instance, as producers, music, poetry, drama, research in PE, dance, okay? We can see students as consumers. Teachers become the producers. They're producing theory for music, annotation, motion analysis in PE, experiments, instructions. So what I'm trying to do here is give you some ideas. Okay, we have a technology. We have a way of using that technology. We can either have the student alone on their own in the privacy of their own lunchbox, engaging with that technology, but there's no interaction. We may finish up having the students blowing each other up, literally in words, as we saw with our earlier example. So when we look at this, how do we create that interaction? And it's really got to do with our use of the teaching and learning. And then, of course, we've got digital video. We've got ourselves as consumers. Often when we do professional development, we're doing most of our professional development by video, and some reflection and modelling and a whole range of challenges around that. And video conferencing, of course, is another way that the digital video comes into the teaching and learning framework. One thing I did remember quite a few years ago, we actually had we got permission from the Premier and the Premier's Justice Department to actually interview prisoners from Lotus Glen. I was teaching a legal studies class at the time, and we were doing prison reform, and they assembled a panel of 3 prisoners who were close to release, and those prisoners sat down in a video conference, and the students actually interviewed those prisoners via video conference. And again, it was a really, really dynamic lesson in which, of course, the video conferencing starred, but the real star was the teaching and learning and the engagement. Students as DV producers, we can look at what happens. Digital video production on pedagogy, it gets increased when teachers are facilitators. So we do the content development. Students are independent. There's peer and group learning. Now I'm quoting some research here from Shuck and Carney, which is really a seminal piece in video production in classrooms. There's emphasis on discovery learning, so you can show a student video and just not say anything. Get each of them to use a card, write down what they think was the most significant thing in that particular video, simple paper card or a piece of paper, submit it to the front anonymously, and you go through them. And then you start generating this discussion. Then the teaching and learning starts, and the technology sits on the desk as it should. And it's authentic. So it's got real world context, it's got real audiences. And if we look at that, for instance, we can actually rate them. It's social constructivist learning, okay? For a start, there's a more capable other. It becomes the student. There's independence and ownership. They take control of the lesson, they take control of the learning. It's collaborative, okay, because it involves interaction with others. It's problem-based because it starts in a space in the real world, and therefore it's authentic and situated. So, you know, DV production, digital video, a really, really powerful tool, and it's very applicable to productive pedagogies. There's 3 modes of student production when we look at it. We can use it simply as a communication tool, and we saw a lot of that in weeks 1 to 5, where we were doing our blogs. You know, we were putting up examples of good communication tools. Now, can we actually get to start using it though as an observation and analysis tool? What skills, what cognitive shift are we going to have to make in order to turn this from a simple narration or a simple expose or an entertaining you know, mind swirl of vision to turn it into something of observational analysis? Now, I know John has done a bit of this with some of his theorising about the manual arts classroom, and some of the other manual arts teachers are actually quite grounded in using digital video and some of the production tools as tools of analysis. So I take my hat off to you. But you know, some of the so-called less hard or softer subject areas, we tend to go for something that's visual and pretty and not powerful. Okay, and it's the least common use of digital video is for observation and analysis, and also for reflection. And these are some of the areas where if we're going to actually start getting into those high-end pedagogies, if we're going to start completing that table, we've got to start moving ourselves into them. Mobile learning, when I lectured at university, not this style of lecturing. I remember some of my lectures used to have 600 face-to-face students, and often did polling. I just used Socratic, a piece of software. So any phone, I'd set up a station on Socratic, and I'd put up a whole lot of multiple choice questions on my PowerPoint. And then students would go to the Socratic site and they would vote. And so we were able to actually test people's understanding as we went through a lecture, you know, and 600 people were able to see how their knowledge and understanding compared to 599 other people's live and face-to-face. So M-learning is fantastic. Wiki, writing a song, great stuff, very collaborative. Mirapolis is the old one I used to use. Okay, it's been really updated now. It's an old version of things. But you can do an encyclopedia collaboratively, write a song. You know, you may be looking at an environmental issue. Get the kids to write a protest song. Get them to do it collaboratively. Create the rules to a new game. Okay, get them to design a board game or a computer game, or even a computer application, an app. Write the rules for a tech workshop or a science lab. All sorts of things you can do. The forum, this is the one we looked at before with our little Anju and Star Wars theme going on. It's actually a piece of software, Mirapolis. There's better ones on the market now. I'm not up to date with them. But all you do is you basically give 3 basic rules. One person plays, one person writes words and movements for that part. You cannot kill another character, and you cannot negate another character's words. For instance, I'm carrying a child, I know you're not. It's not Jerry Springer, it's actually Meropolis. So enforcing those laws, is the way you do that is not by standing over people, it's by way of interaction, and creating standards and rules for engagement. It's a really, really fun way to demonstrate understanding, where you can actually get one student to explain something to another. Okay, and then the other student, of course, then has to question and query that explanation and review it. Lots of things you can do. Blogging, I'm not going to say too much about that, other than that we're looking at our e-portfolio, and it's good for online journals. It's good for that sort of stuff. But our e-portfolio for assessment task 2 is really essentially going to be a streaming Weebly or a blog. Audio, video, data conferencing. Some of the things that I use almost on a daily basis, because my partner lives in Cairns, I'm Skyping daily. Google Docs, I mean, it's great. You're portable, you can get them anywhere, you can pull them down out of the sky. Dragon Easy Speaking. I mean, I often sit talking to my computer and it writes my words. Messenger, Zoom, Jabber conferencing, all essential pieces of audio, video, data conferencing software. Now, think about, in my classroom, this is why I'm just reminding you of these technologies. Think about when you complete your table, what you would like to use in your classroom. What alternatives there are. Can you actually get your kids onto Jabber? Can you have video conferences? Can you do video conferencing with people, external experts? Okay, a whole range of different questions you can consider. And the summary for today's session, okay, basically toolishness is foolishness. And that's the motto I want you to keep in mind when you're doing this task. Okay, it's one thing to have links to pedagogy, but embed those links, okay, in your ICT connections and make what you do in your classroom ICT relevant. Don't let the technology take over. We saw what happened to poor old Laurie and to Carl. It can end up in tears. So the message is keep your focus, keep control of the technology, give it its purpose, make it authentic in the purpose you give it. Then let it go and let the teaching and the learning survive. Let it be independent of the technology. However, computers can communicate facilitation, and computer-mediated communication can facilitate really deep learning. And this is the skill we're looking at now, that interaction. Consider how you can use technology to facilitate effective interaction. The things we talked about were reflection, metacognition, setting up a framework whereby students look at a video and you may give them 3 questions to ask. You may give them 5 points to observe. Discussions. Taking leadership roles. Okay, actually getting a student to lead. Mentoring, getting to mentor people through a concept. Coaching. Problem solving, analysis, synthesis and evaluation. So as you can see, analysis, synthesis and evaluation are all Bloom's higher order skills. When we're looking at our use of technology, the question is, how do we pull ourselves along? We know we've got a general capability here for each subject we teach. We know that we can do that in a low-end way. We can give it lip service, or we can do it in a high-end way. We can link it to our pedagogy. We can connect it through ICTs, and then we can look at classroom applications. I'm going to stop talking there and just open the floor for any questions or comments.
It's Phoebe again. So I guess in our pedagogy map, we just need to make sure that our examples for each literacy, numeracy, etc., for each of those all have examples of how we can use technologies and stuff. I guess that's the main part of that connection, being the digital pedagogies course. We just need to make sure that we give examples of how we can use technology. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And look, at this stage, you're not actually talking about technology in that 4th column. It's just links to pedagogy. So what you're talking about here is, okay, low-end pedagogy is the 2nd column. 3rd column is high-end pedagogy. And so your link to pedagogy is, now here you explain, for instance, how students are going to use literacy, for instance, to get into a deeper mode of learning, into a deeper understanding. So if you look at Wendy's example, and I'll just drag it back over for you. We can refer to this. See if I can make it a little bit bigger. So there we go. What we've got here is the links to pedagogy. This is the column that you're only supposed to get up to this week. Okay, this is the beginning column. So you can see what she's done. Students understand ways to represent and comprehend texts, including multimedia, charts, graphs, etc., etc. Low end, teach it. Do a demonstration up front, a drill and practice. The very first slide in this presentation. High end, provide opportunities for students to make decisions about complex information. Okay, how they learn best. Okay, basically critique a range of texts and ways the ideas and knowledge are represented. So this is what I would do in my pedagogy. This would be my intent. Deep knowledge and higher order thinking. Students use critical analysis to interpret and construct media texts. Okay, so she's basically saying here what to do, what happens when students learn best. Okay, they're in the high-end pedagogy. What does this mean in terms of higher order thinking? They're using critical analysis to interpret and construct multimedia texts.
Hi, Colin. I was just going to ask you, so I'm doing history and geography. Do I do the whole HAS, so all of the social sciences, or can I just focus on, say, geography?
See, I would just focus on the one.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, what we're doing here is you're actually developing your curriculum connections. You're not becoming an expert across a really broad subject base. So what you're doing is you're learning your way around the curriculum maps. You're learning how to construct a curriculum map, how to build links to pedagogy, and how to incorporate ICTs. Now, as I said to you, I too think this is quite an ugly task, but I think once you start it, you actually realise it's not that complex. From the general capabilities, we can produce a low-end technology, a high-end pedagogy, a low-end pedagogy, a high-end pedagogy, and then we can develop links to our pedagogy. So what are the links to the pedagogy we want to make? We want deep knowledge and higher order thinking. We want students to learn best. Okay? Culturally, we want them to demonstrate knowledge. In terms of student direction, students, we want them to make their own decision. We want them to be independent. So I think if you use those three, you know, again, she's got different articulations here as she goes through. As you're going through looking at your general capabilities, try and link them to pedagogy wherever you can. Think about, you know, what would my productive pedagogy look like in this situation? What is the high-end pedagogy? What would I be trying to achieve? You know, I'd be trying to create effective learning, deep understanding. I'd be trying to break down cultural limitations. I'd be trying to create independent students. I would be trying to create an authentic problem-based curriculum. Okay, all of those different things. And some of these words come directly from the generic capabilities. That's where she's got them from. She's not making them up. So, excuse me, when you look at your general capabilities, she's using active inquiry and creative thinking. And these, you know, problems are real and relevant. Problems are complex and require deep thinking. So they are criteria that she's gotten from those pages. So if you haven't had a look at the generic capabilities yet, do, because this will make a lot more sense. It goes through each of the 7 capabilities, and for each of the 7 capabilities it lists different points, like problems are real and relevant. If problems are real and relevant, then you've got active inquiry. If problems are complex and require deep thinking, then you've got active inquiry. If students are determined within limits of the pace, if they're self-determining in terms of what they study, you've got active inquiry. If they're developing cultural knowledges, you've got active inquiry. So this statement on the left-hand side is supported by these statements in the document. Okay, that's where she's got that from. I know it looks like rocket science, but it's actually come directly from those general capability statements. It's a tricky one. So I do urge you to go and have a look at them if you haven't yet. And those of you who have will realise that all of these components, how students learn best, cultural knowledges, that they are all in the literacy statement. Okay, so they're all there for you. So you're not making them up. You're simply selecting them and commenting on them. Later on, you'll look at how you're going to connect through ICTs, what ICTs you'll use. Then You're going to look at how you do that in your classroom. And here's where assessment task 2 comes in. You'll develop little examples of that in your portfolio. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Colin, it's Rodney again.
Fire away.
Just looking what you're discussing here, and you may have covered in the first 20 minutes that I was absent, this is the first of number 1 of the 6 bullet points in the task details of the unit profile.
Yes.
Yeah, and then obviously point number 2, the extension of pedagogy, is those right-hand columns, and we'll come to that in the next couple of weeks.
That's correct, yes. Yep. And what's happened is, Rodney, she's put the whole table up there. And of course, columns 5 and 6, sorry, we're going to be filling in later. Okay? That's futuristic stuff.
Thanks, Colin.
And the real challenge for this week is to, review these documents, the general capabilities, select a subject area that you're going to focus your assessment on in the Weebly, and then start mapping out your table in exactly the way that Wendy's done it here. Select a general capability, low-end pedagogy, high-end pedagogy, and then use the statements in this capability to look at what it needs to be, what the characteristics of a deep understanding or a deep pedagogy are in this particular description. They're given to you. All you need to do is assemble them. And then as we go on, you're actually going to then start filling in your ICT connections and also examples in your own classroom. So by the time we finish, you'll have a table which takes a generic capability, a low-end version, a high-end version. You've got your groundwork here, what you're going to try and achieve. You've got the ICTs you're going to use, and finally, you'll have some examples of how you've done that. I don't know if there's an easier way of putting that assessment task together, but like you, I did have a bit of trouble getting my head around it as well. But it does make sense once you look at the documents. Any other questions? Is it time for us to hit the record button and get this produced?